Hello, and welcome back to the Out of Program podcast. Today, we're joined by Dr. Alastair Darwood, a medical doctor with a bioengineering PhD. He works as an inventor and an entrepreneur, building new technologies across medical devices, cycling hardware, and consumer products. Hi, Alastair. Welcome to the show.
Nice to meet you, Jing. Really great to be here.
Excellent. So we're going to dive straight in. And you had a very interesting career starting from medical school. So I want to jump in right there. Now, you founded your first startup, Prometheus Surgical, while you were at medical school. So do you want to walk me through how that all came about?
Sure. I was always really interested in inventing, building, tinkering, which actually was one of the things which guided me towards medical school, because a lot of medicine, I certainly felt, certainly in the surgical sphere, was very much just that. It was building, doing sort of delicate manual tasks to try and help people. So I went through medical school always with that idea of wanting to go down a surgical pathway. But at the same time, I enjoyed inventing, building, just trying to solve difficult problems, I guess. So towards the middle of medical school, I remember working with an orthopedic surgeon who had a question about guiding hip, knee, and shoulder prostheses into place. So we looked predominantly at shoulder replacements. And at the time, one of the best ways of guiding shoulder replacements was using a 3D printed guide jig. It was basically a block that came off a 3D printer. It was sterilized, brought into the operative site. And in the shoulder replacement context, it was placed into the glenoid cavity. And it had a little guide hole, so you could drill a guide wire through the hole. It was called a PSI, a patient-specific instrument. And that guided the surgeon's prosthesis into the right place. And this was a very laborious, quite manual process. You had to offload 3D geometry to a 3D printing company. They'd print it, they'd send it back to you in the right place. So I challenged myself to try and come up with a new approach to, rather than trying to optimize what exists, it was creating something completely new to guide intraoperative arthroplasty from a preoperative plan. And that generated Prometheus Surgical as a startup. It was a very small company. It was really just myself and some contractors within Imperial College. We raised a very small amount of angel investment, developed a working prototype, which was taken through sort of, let's call it, benchtop trials. Then, to cut a long story short, I finished medical school, started FY1, and sold the company in FY1 to a company called Souter Medical. They're probably one of the world's best known orthopedic power tool companies. And as of probably a year ago, the robot has achieved regulatory compliance in the UK, and it's being used on patients, which is quite exciting.
I mean, that is an incredible story, but I feel like you've really glossed over some of the most interesting parts of that, which is just around the actual founding, because I think many clinicians and medical students, find the barrier to entry a bit lower for a digital solution, right? You just need to find a software developer or a friend to be able to build something and launch. But you went in very deep with a medical device. And you kind of mentioned that you spotted the opportunity and then you went for it. But I'd like to know a bit more about how you approached actually taking the concept and starting a medical device business, because that is not an easy feat. So I'd love to kind of hear more about that.
So business is a strong word, because in both of my medtech endeavors, so both Prometheus Surgical and what we'll come on to later on inspired ventilation, it's not really a business. It's an entity that holds some IP that I've validated, and then I've taken that IP and I've started working with a large player who's going to do the research and development to take that through to patients. Now, that's quite a big distinction, because when some people say medical device startup, they think about actually starting a company, having many employees in the company, doing the regulatory parts yourself, selling the device yourself, having a marketing team. My particular area of interest, and I hope the area that I'm relatively good at, is finding the problem, finding a solution, maybe patenting a solution if it's a patentable feature, doing the science to try and validate that, and then I'm not for a moment saying this is the correct thing to do. It happens to be what I've done. It's then finding a partner to license to or to sell to, predominantly because I'm quite aware that the process to take a piece of medical device IP, even if it's scientifically validated, through to a device to use in humans is an astronomical challenge, full of many individual parts that I'm personally not particularly good at or not particularly interested in, i.e. the business development side of things, which is why I've chosen to partner with large industry manufacturers. So coming back to your question, when you asked me about starting the business, it was a business in the sense that on paper there was a company, the company owned a piece of IP, but the business didn't do anything other than research and development. But I guess you do touch on a point, which is that creating particularly medical devices or hardware is hard. You've always heard that phrase, hardware is hard. But I'd probably take a slight step back, because it's not so much hardware I'm interested in, it's invention that I'm interested in. And invention can be in the hardware space, invention can be in the software space. It's really creating something where something didn't exist before, rather than what a lot of digital health startups do very well, may I add, which is optimization of a process which before that startup might have been terrible. So, take patchwork as an example. Locum people could always sign up to locum shifts before, but you took that ecosystem and absolutely brought it into the 21st century using your patchwork platform.
I hear what you're saying in terms of all the aspects related to business. You focused on the R&D side, whereas you had a partner that did the distribution and the commercialization. But regardless, though, I just want to press on this further, because you were only a medical student at that point. And I know many medical students, even at the early stage in their career, go on to do incredible things. But it requires a lot of skills to be able to conceive of the idea, to, generate the IP, to prototype it, and even do the initial commercialization before a medical device company is willing to take it on board. So how did you figure all of that out, at such an early stage in your career?
Let's break the question down into a few parts. Let's talk about the technology side first. So how do you prototype and how do you build something? Now it's very different, and we'll come on to that in a moment with the rise of LLMs and so on. And we can talk about that later, because it's an interesting discussion topic. Back then, I think it came from a childhood and early teenage years of just being fascinated with how things work. Ultimately, maybe this is my reductionist view, but medical school was really just a big course in doing the how things work of the human body. Human beings at a really basic level, we're machines. We have inputs, we have outputs, we have complex control algorithms controlling the various parts. So there's similarities between taking apart a DVD player and looking inside a human abdomen to work out how to repair something. So I think I was always fascinated with how things worked. I liked the modular structure of technology, because I always give the analogy of Lego bricks. If you take apart that, I know, DVD player, I'm going old school now, we're going back to the early 2000s. There's lots of individual parts inside that DVD player that come together to form the eventual device. And even in the sort of 2013, 2014, when I was building these sorts of things, you could still go on eBay and you could buy a scanner module, you could buy some servos, you could put those parts together in a 3D printed base so they could move around and provide some mechatronic controllable parts to start putting together the prototype. So the building of the parts isn't particularly difficult. There's an element of trial and error where I'm conscious that we're talking about two different eras almost. There's the pre-AI, post-AI era of how you go about building these prototypes. But at the same time, I'll give you another example. I started playing around with drones and quadcopters, and I remember during medical school building my own ones, just off kits downloaded from the internet. So the technology, putting things together to make prototypes, wasn't particularly hard. What was harder is finding the problem and trying to come up with an inventive solution. Inventing something was tricky, and that's why I really enjoyed it, because it's such a satisfying problem to solve. If someone goes, here's something you need to solve, and you come up with an inventive solution, it's an amazing feeling. I don't really know how you train that. It's a hard thing to do. I've had a lot of years of trying to do it, and I think I'm getting better. But it's a hard thing. I think it's coming from the mental attitude of rejecting what someone says to you is the norm and how you do things, and accepting that there could be other solutions. So I remember that as a medical student, you go through medical school, you're constantly told, this is the management pathway for X. This is how you do this procedure. This is how you, the workflow for this particular patient pathway through the hospital. And it's developing that understanding of saying, well, actually, I don't agree. and I'm going to see if I can do something better. Because it's only when you do that that you break out of this perhaps optimization cycle that a lot of digital health finds itself in, where you say, okay, I've got this existing workflow for managing X, Y, or Z condition. I'm going to make an app which tracks symptoms and so on. And all it's really doing is optimizing an existing pathway rather than saying, well, hang on a second, why am I making an app that tracks symptom pathways? Actually, what I'm going to do is create a wearable device which pre-predicts using X, Y, or Z algorithm before symptoms even exist to just completely change the branch of that pathway. And that's what really, really excites me and really interests me.
Super interesting. I suppose in this journey, in this initial journey, you also mentioned that you exited, which is very rare in the world of health tech. So tell me a little bit about how that kind of came about.
So it's been a bit of a almost cringe story in the first instance, because as a very naive medical student, I thought to myself, "Oh, great! I've done all the IP validation. I can just send a few emails out to large orthopedic companies and go from there." But how wrong I was. I think it's an interesting story. We actually engaged KPMG to act as an M&A advisor
Hmm.
for us. They put together quite a few meetings. We met with, Stryker, Zimmer, J&J, but I think I was this naive 21-year-old, or I can't remember how old I was, um, meeting these industry players with a very, very half-baked prototype. Yes, there was some IP there, but it needed to be a huge amount more R&D work on that side of things. So actually, it was a meeting arranged by Professor Roger Emery, who was the main, the sort of the clinician driver on the project, with De Souter. De Souter are a very dynamic, family-owned business, and they're not afraid of difficult R&D projects. So I think De Souter saw the potential in the project and didn't shy away from that knowledge that they were going to put significant time, effort, and resource and significant skill into going from what was just about a little bit more advanced than a sketch on a piece of paper through to something that works in humans. And actually, just one note I want to add while I mention it. One thing that's very useful, which I always still advise any clinician founders when they ask me these sorts of things, is to engage with an industry clinical leader. In my case, it was Professor Emery. Professor Emery had a small equity holding in the company, and that was really important to give yourself some weight in the area. So as a medical student in the world of orthopedics, I was effectively a nobody, quite understandably a nobody. So it was a bit weird for me to come up with it with these sort of novel robotic platform. But having Prof. Emery coming along with the project really added some precedent to the business and allowed people to take it seriously.
Yeah, because that was going to be my immediate follow-up, but I think you've partially answered that, which is, what I'm hearing is that as a 21-year-old, you were instructing KPMG. I mean, that is an incredible situation to be in. I guess my question was that in setting everything up, you mentioned Professor Emery, but did you have any other kind of advisors as you were formulating this and bringing it to commercial use?
No, because my intention had always been to start a company, which effectively, it's a form you fill out on Companies House,
Mm.
assign the IP into the company, so the company owns the intellectual property, and then from that point, the plan was always to try and license or exit just at the IP level. We raised £170,000, and that was predominantly spent by contracting out an Imperial College mechatronics lab to build a benchtop working prototype. So I actually built the first prototype just in my room at Nottingham, which it fake worked. So I could fake it on my laptop to make the thing move and look like it worked. It didn't actually work. And then we contracted Imperial to make a actual working device, which wouldn't be allowed to go anywhere near people, but it could work on plastic bones to demonstrate the concept.
And gosh, I'm dwelling a bit too much on this early experience, but it honestly is so interesting. What did your friends think of you? Like, if you're constructing
Eh,
medical devices in your dorm, like, what was the perception?
I don't know. I guess they thought it was weird and cool. It's weird if it doesn't work, and it's cool if it works and goes and gets acquired. But it's interesting. I think I I only have good memories from that period. I was doing what I enjoyed, which is sitting with a soldering iron and some nuts and bolts and building
Mm.
things. I found that hugely satisfying at the time. And
Mm.
actually, as if I look at how that was 10 years ago to how inventing and building is now, it's only getting better, faster. Even this week, with the use case of having your sort of PhD level LLM sitting there guiding you in hardware development, that
Mm.
in a project in the last 3 weeks, it would have probably taken 8 months to a year 10 years ago. And it's taken 3 to 4 weeks now because I just have guides in whatever I need to have guides and just telling me what to do, which is quite cool. But I think the orthopedic robotic platform, by the way, if you want to look it up, it's called the Solito robot. That was certainly a really interesting start. And it's completely accidentally put me onto the platform of going, okay, well, I can invent things, validate them, and then try and license or sell to an existing medical device player, which then spares me from having to do the regulatory marketing, the in-depth R&D, and lets me go off and invent and build new things.
Mhm. No, it's a great model.
Yeah.
You sold that initial business, and then you moved on to a second venture while you were a foundation doctor around low-cost trauma ventilation during a very interesting time, which was the
Mm.
pandemic. So tell me a bit more about that second venture.
So I didn't particularly enjoy F1. I did a trauma and accidents emergency elective in a township hospital in South Africa, which I loved. And then I went straight from sort of stab wounds, intubating people, probably slightly in a slightly dodgy way as a medical student, straight into a care of the elderly job as F1. So I found that a bit slow. But my F2 I loved. I went straight into it. Was an academic surgical job at St Mary's, and that gave me time to stay on the on-call rota, which was great in an acute hospital, but time to sit and invent, really. And the invention I had at the time was a way of making a very, very cheap ventilator. So I designed and built this project. This actually came from the elective in South Africa, seeing the need for such a product. But as I was designing and building this device, the pandemic happened. Now, just to get the timescales here, so I finished F2, I think it was about mid 2018, 2019. I started a bioengineering PhD in something completely different at Imperial, but I was letting the ventilator invention tick along. Then the pandemic hit. And you remember the story, the UK government started saying, right, we need to produce ventilators very, very quickly. I had a startup that had a really good design for a low-cost ventilator. So I was partnered with the Red Bull Advanced Technologies outfit. They make the Formula One car. Over a period of about 2 months, we very rapidly tooled and manufactured this low-cost ventilator, which actually started working incredibly well. The story ends quite abruptly because as we started to realize during the pandemic that these low-cost ventilators were A, not needed, and B, not appropriate to manage critically unwell COVID patients. So the program was shut down by the government. But my goodness, it was an interesting 2 months. Actually, at the same time, I founded Scarpa, which is a cycling company, which we'll come to in a moment, and the pain relief company. But it was a very interesting story for an invention which was maybe needed in the trauma context, definitely not needed in the COVID pandemic context. But actually, I still have that patent. It's still ticking along. I think it's quite a nice patent. I haven't done anything with it yet. I need to think of something to do with it.
That is very cool. You touched upon the PhD in bioengineering. I mean, you'd already had two inventions companies under your belt, and it sounded like for some reason you wanted even more expertise. So, what was the motivation for pursuing that?
So I finished F2, still fairly sure I was going to go down a surgical career. And I was advised to start the PhD for two reasons. First of all, to formalize my research training. Secondly, if I was going to leave medicine, to have a formal engineering qualification. And thirdly, because I enjoyed research and science, it was always nice to hone those skills. So in a way, rather than me taking an F3, F4, F5 year, it was to say, right, let's stop, think about what's going on, and do this PhD as a bit of I guess you could call it an incredibly useful holding pattern for a few years to allow me to work on some inventions on the side while doing something productive in the research sphere to decide what I was going to do next. It was, and actually, it was in something quite different. It was in orthobiologics, so stem cell research and orthopedics, creating devices to try and enhance stem cells for orthopedic applications. So it was almost a device development PhD, which I enjoyed. It was an interesting few years. And also it taught me one important lesson, which is unless you're prepared to spend decades, don't do any inventions or startups to do with cells. Because my
Yeah.
goodness, these are, I love to think on a basic level, they are still machines. It's just engineering. It's just really complicated engineering, but they do not work as you think they're going to work. It's really difficult. Cells, orthobiologics, they're fascinating. And if you do manage to harness any of these technologies, you can do incredible, amazing things, but it's really difficult. I
Yeah.
remember countless experiments where, the output of the experiment changed depending on which way the wind was blowing outside. So that was
Wow.
always,
Wow.
always very, very tricky.
Now that is absolutely a cautionary tale to anything involving
Yeah.
the wet lab.
Yes. Wet lab is very hard. So,
Yeah, and we've only briefly touched upon this surgical track that you were pursuing.
yeah.
So tell me how that all fit in, because you even went as far as to pursue MRCS, so membership to the Royal College of Surgeons. So how are you viewing the surgical career and your surgical training alongside all of this invention and this academia? Because those are a lot of plates to spin.
So my original plan was to fully go down the surgical route. I was initially interested in orthopedics, as you can probably imagine, um, because I enjoyed operating. Albeit very basic operations that I did as an SHO. I enjoyed the sort of cracking open the bonnet, if you like, and using some tools to try and repair the problem. But what I didn't realize, and this was the hard bit about modern surgical training, is that you'd almost have to run through fighting and struggling to try and do the operating. And you just end up spending your time doing all the rest, seeing patients in clinic, doing ward work, which is all essential, practical things that you need to do to deliver a good service. But I just found it incredibly infuriating when I couldn't just click my fingers and have something done because I could see a more efficient way to do things. So I always have this joke with my wife that I would have absolutely adored doing surgery in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s, where you could have gone, I'm going to have this interesting idea about how to change X, Y, or Z, and I'm going to try and develop that bit of research. So anyway, so I did my MRCS to look into doing surgery as a career. Slowly realized that maybe a better option was to do something like interventional radiology, which we discussed previously, which would still be useful having that surgical background. And actually started radiology training. This was after the PhD, but I basically I need to be more active in the invention and innovation space, and made the decision to leave.
If I understand correctly, you haven't fully left clinical practice as a whole because you're still locuming to this day. So how does that all fit now in your current career aspirations and with your other roles?
So I'm fully aware that I effectively have no medical career aspirations anymore. I do the occasional locuming, maybe one shift a month sort of thing to A, pretend I'm still a doctor, and B, because I enjoy it. I like seeing how the frontline works. I'm developing one of my devices now is an acute analgesia and sedation system, which will be used hopefully on the front line. And it's important to stay grounded in what patients' experience is, how it works to be a doctor in the UK. So it's something I do because I enjoy it and because I think it's important to, as an inventor who wants to work with medical devices, to see how they're being used. But I'm fully aware that I have no clinical future. I'm never going to go past the dodgy SHO stage, and I've just about made peace with that. It took me a long time to make peace with that. My wife is ST6 obs and gynae surgeon, and I'm very jealous of her job. She does look like she has a fun job when she gets to go in and do 5 cesareans a day. But then I hear about all the rest of it, and I go, "Yeah, I made the right decision."
Yeah, yeah. There's inevitably trade-offs, of course, and clearly you've had a lot of success in the commercial aspects of your life. I want to talk now a bit about Scarpa, which is the e-bike that you've developed, and this is a bit of a curveball, a bit tangential to besides the fact that it's hardware. So, can you tell me more about how that came about?
Sure. I mean, so I developed Scarpa at the same time as my pain relief and sedation mask, which I'm sure we'll mention next. Um, Scarpa was the same process as medical devices. I like inventing. I like solving problems with novel devices that didn't exist before, and I like cycling. So Scarpa was really about taking a bicycle, which is a beautiful piece of engineering designed for human efficiency, but acknowledging the fact that some people might want electrical assistance at different times. For example, 6 a.m. on a Monday and you don't want to be sweaty going into work, or you're recovering from an injury and you want to still cycle. So it was challenging myself to develop a new way of electrifying any bicycle without changing the underlying bicycle in a novel way. So in a nutshell, Scarpa was founded in 2020. We've raised £14 million so far. There's
Wow.
22 employees in the company, and we started selling commercially 6 months ago. So we're now stocked in about 70 shops in the UK, and we're an electrification solution to about 7 OEMs. So, for example, if you go on Ribble's website, I don't know how much you know cycling, but the brand Ribble, and you scroll through as if you're trying to buy a bike, it will ask you at the end, do you want your bike with a Scarpa or without a Scarpa as the electrification solution? But I will add my main input in Scarpa. So I invented the underlying technology. I helped to overcome many of the major engineering challenges, but I had two amazing co-founders who really just handle everything to do with the business side of things, so the marketing, the sales, everything to do with running a company. Coming back to one of the questions you asked at the beginning about starting a business, Scarpa is an actual business, but I don't have to do any of the business side of it. I just do the inventing and solving problems part.
Well, that's certainly the beauty of having talented co-founders. But I was going to say that, as an avid cyclist myself, it's incredible that you've managed to develop this and get it to market. Um,
Mm.
how has this experience been different to the medical devices?
I actually think it's quite similar in the sense that Scarpa just took it further before. Well, it hasn't yet exited, but it took it further. So if I took any of the medical ventures and wanted to continue the development myself, I'd have to go down a very similar Scarpa-esque path. And what that probably means is finding co-founders, or certainly employing many more members of a team to help, whether it's in the regulatory side, in the development side, or the manufacturing side. So it's almost on the same continuum. The Scarpa regulatory process is significantly easier than a medical device for obvious reasons, but it's still very much there. There is a regulatory process to check it's safe and check it's a product that isn't going to injure people. So it's not so much it's different, it's just that I've got off the direct handling of the project earlier for medical device development compared to for Scarpa. But if I look at the pain relief and sedation system, that sort of more mirrors the Souter process. But in this one, I haven't actually exited. I've licensed the IP.
And then you've mentioned the analgesic mask a couple of times. So can you tell me a bit more about that? Did you run the same playbook, or did you adapt it, given the extensive experience that you've had with devices now?
So I remember during COVID, I think probably 2020 or 2021, doing a locum shift and giving lots of patients the green whistle Penthrox inhaler. I don't know if you've ever seen it before. It's a plastic tube and you pour in some methoxyfluorine. It's an old volatile anesthetic into the tube. The patients put it in their mouth and they inhale. It's sort of an Entonox replacement. And it works really well for 5-10 minutes. But you're limited in terms of the patient having to coordinate their breathing and hold the tube. So for something that's really bad, or for a medical or surgical procedure, you don't really have the reliability of analgesia. So I was using this device and I realized to myself, it's a really nice way of using a volatile anesthetic agent, which is it's a bit of a magic drug. It really is magic. It's a liquid you inhale. It sedates. It can give an element of analgesia. It can give some amnesia and anxiolysis. So I thought to myself, there must be a better way of giving these volatile anesthetic agents. And if you look at the history of anesthesia, late Victorian era, people started using the Schimmelbusch mask. It was a gauze pad over someone's nose and mouth. You'd pour on ether or chloroform. And believe it or not, that was used up until the 40s or 50s, even in the UK. And the Penthrox inhaler is actually a similar concept. It's a 120-year-old device. Just back then, it was a metal tube as opposed to a plastic tube. And different volatile agents were poured into the tube for patients to inhale. So I said to myself, there must be a better way. We have to recreate this. And the reason why there was a need to recreate this is I remember in my surgical jobs, you'd have patients with minor problems, so buttock abscess, for example, and they'd come in and you'd see them in the SAU, And he'd say, well, I'm really sorry, you have to go home now and you have to fast and come back in at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning, which is just crazy because they'd have to come in for a full GA for something which it just didn't need the GA from a physiological standpoint. There was just no way in a surgical assessment unit environment, certainly as an F2 doctor, to go, oh, I'm just going to give you some propofol now, or I'm just going to give you some fentanyl now and do it yourself, because that would just be stupidly dangerous. And that paradigm is reflected across medical specialties. You never have a gynecology consultant going, well, this hysteroscopy is going to be really painful, so I'm just going to give you some fentanyl in this outpatient clinic so I can do it myself. It's never going to happen because of the huge safety risk. So actually, these patients will come in for a general anesthetic that they just don't need, at massive economic loss to the NHS and detriment to the patient. And you know just as well as me the waiting lists in certain specialties as a result of these issues. So if you can create a device which can be relatively universal, go on a patient, and deliver reliable, very powerful analgesia, sedation, anxiolysis, and amnesia, that's potentially an incredible device. So I started the design work, and I remember, I have these memories in some of the COVID lockdowns of sitting in our garden in our flat in Camden, sketching out some concepts. And what I came up with effectively is a Victorian Schimmelbusch mask, so gauze pad and a mask on your face, but digitally controlled. So the product output was effectively a disposable face mask. It looks a bit Star Wars. It's got 2 charcoal filters on either side, and it's literally got a gauze pad in the front of the mask with some indicator LEDs. Then there's a handpiece, and the handpiece has a small peristaltic pump inside. It's got a syringe, which you fill with sevoflurane, and some control electronics with a big button. So put simply, it's patient-controlled inhalational analgesia. The patient presses and holds a button. That microdoses small amounts of sevoflurane liquid into the gauze pad. The patient inhales, pulls room air through the mask, vaporizing the drug. And when they exhale again, the charcoal filters capture the exhaled sevoflurane. And then there are some LEDs on top of the device to effectively assess consciousness, to check if you're awake or asleep. So I developed some basically benchtop prototypes using veterinary monitors, actually, because I couldn't get hold of any human sevoflurane monitors. And I created some benchtop prototypes with a ventilator breathing in and out through the system, simulating breathing, with a device that you could press and hold a button to make the device work. And this was a bit more of a company than Prometheus Surgical. I had one employee. It was myself and an industrial designer developing these concepts. And in 2022, we had a patent, which was pretty much granted in the UK. We had a benchtop model showing how you could dynamically adjust the level of sevoflurane delivered in this new mechanism. And I went to Surgical, who you may or may not have heard of them. They're the UK's largest supplier of anything to do with anaesthesia systems. So they make anything green in a hospital is probably made by Surgical. And Surgical looked at the concept, loved it, and proposed a licensing deal. So they took a license on the IP, and very, very shortly after starting work, they got on with almost productizing the device, taking my initial design and seeing about how you put it into mass manufacture. We worked together to do a study using an existing anesthetic machine to deliver sevoflurane to healthy participants. So what we wanted to test is, could you use a button press to deliver sevoflurane? Because if your arm muscle still allows you to press a button even at dangerous levels of sevoflurane, the whole project was a no-go. So we did this first study to validate that, yes, sevoflurane is safe to be delivered by a button press. There was no safety risk in terms of stopping breathing and so on. It's an amnesic, it's a sedative, it's anxiolytic, and most interestingly, it's analgesic. If you ask any anaesthetist, they'll say, oh no, sevoflurane is not an analgesic. Actually, it might be, as we proved in that first study. So that was in 2023, and that's now been published. We then went back to the drawing board, took all of the learnings from that initial study using an anesthetic machine that we faked to make it the product, to actually make a device. And that device is now in use at St Mary's Hospital on healthy participants. We put electrode pads on the abdominal and back musculature. We cause a cramp. I've had it done. It's horrible. It's supposed to be validated to be as bad as childbirth. It's really, really nasty. So we effectively cause these cramps in healthy participants. We give them the device, and effectively we say to them, use this to manage your pain. And we're about to finish the first trial on 18 participants.
Incredible. And you mentioned that you're using the devices. You've had the devices used on yourself. Are you
No,
running
not
these,
the mask. I've had the the pain stimulation. I've tried to go into the trial, but I'm not allowed. I'm one of the researchers. It would be inappropriate.
Ah, yes.
I'd love to do it because it's very hard for me to design the algorithm for it to work without trying it myself. But yeah, I'm not allowed to try it myself.
So just to clarify, are you leading the study, or is that being
No,
provided
that
by Intersurgical?
there's a few different arms. So Intersurgical's funding the trial. Then we have an anaesthetist called Chris Mullington, who's, let's call him our independent expert. So Chris
Mhm.
is independent. He's leading the delivery of the trial, and we together developed the trial protocol. Paul's technical team has developed the final device. Sort of I sit and integrate those different parts, things thinking this is the algorithm I want. If there are any design changes, I talk about it with the intersurgical team. And basically look at how the participants are responding and think if there are any changes to the underlying invention that we need to do. And then Intersurgical has the expertise to say, okay, to do this in a disposable device at mass manufacture, this is how we need to build it. This is the type of plastic we need to use here. This is the circuit we need to do here. This is how we deal with the radio frequency interference. This is how we go through regulatory and so on and so forth. And that's the advantage of doing the licensing playbook, because I have no idea about a lot of those things, mass manufacturing or the regulatory side of things. So it's very nice to have the big silverback mountain gorilla in my
Mm.
backyard who can help push through on those sorts of things. They're an amazing partner to work with. And actually, as it
And
happens, we're taking that IP and splitting it into many other domains. And I've talked to you about a mask, but we're doing a maternity focused one for obstetric pain. We're looking at a dental version. So there's lots of different applications there.
it's very exciting. So where we are today is that you have raised 14 million for Scarpa, and you've brought that product to market, the e-bikes. Alongside this, you are contributing to the R&D for the device that you created around the analgesic mask. And you're running that in St. Mary's alongside a bit of clinical work. I suppose the inevitable question I'm going to ask is, how do you juggle all these responsibilities? And especially given that you've raised 14 million, is there not an expectation for you to be all in on Scarpa? How do they view that interplay between the different innovations that you're running?
So I think I've always pitched myself as an inventor, and I've never promised to be anything more than an inventor and a scientist. And I've certainly made it quite clear that I don't like to engage on any of the business development side of things.
Mm.
So with that in mind, on anything that I do, I've never had any sort of full time and attention, because what I always say, and if investors ask the question, I always say that I will apply, and I'm always there 24/7, 365 days a year, whenever I'm needed on something. So, so if we take Scarpa as the example, back a few years ago, that was a huge problem because we couldn't get the disc rotor to survive. So actually, when I left clinical medicine, one of the things I went straight in to do was just work flat out to try and to invent a solution to that problem. Um, and I think as any startup founder will tell you, I don't know if you may agree or disagree. If you've got a really juicy problem that you're working in your head to try and solve, I've been on CAD at 2, 3, 4 in the morning many a time to solve problems because it needs to be done. So I've always said that the only limit I put on myself is a limit whereby I know that I can achieve something and not do something badly. That's the only limit. So in terms of my time management right now, my clinical medicine is vanishingly small fractions of amount of time. But if you look at Scarpa, if you look at Inspire Ventilation, if you look at other projects, I just basically adjust the amount of time spent based on what's needed, because ultimately myself and my co-founders all have the same goal, which is to do something useful. If time management's ever a problem, I can solve that one, then go to another one and smooth things over.
Very interesting. So then I suppose, we're coming to the end of our time together. I suppose the question that I have for you is, lots of people listening will be fascinated by your story of going from being a medic to becoming an inventor. What advice or recommendations would you have for medical students or clinicians as a whole, who are looking to get into medical devices? What would you say to them?
So where we are today is like being on another planet to where we were 10 years ago in terms of how to do things. And what do I mean by that? Well, everyone always goes on, everyone eye rolls a little bit about saying, oh, AI has changed everything. But in the world of being very specific now, in the world of inventing new things and trying to patent things, AI has been beyond transformative. And what do I mean by that? 2 years ago, if I invented a new device and the device had code or it had electronics or it had complex engineering inside the device, I could invent something, I could sketch it on paper and I can file a patent. That's no problem. But I'd usually have to have hired an electrical engineer. I'd have hired a PCB designer. I'd have hired a mechanical engineer to try and do some basic calculations. And all those people would have had to do a bit of research and work out something. But now, with the advent of LLMs, the thing that's impressing me the most is that you really do have a PhD understanding of everything in your pocket. So to give you a practical example of this, over the last 3 weeks, I've been working on something that uses high power electronic switching for a new project I'm working on. And people can go to university to do a degree in electrical and electronic engineering, and they can spend a 6-month course learning about transistor power switching, for example. I certainly know very, very little about it. But with the help of an LLM, I've got to the point where I've gone, these are the parts I need to buy. These are how you need to connect the parts together. Here's the code that you need to run the thing, all from me just describing what I want to do. Now, I'm a relatively technical person. I know how to solder. I have a relatively good practical understanding of what's possible and what's not possible. But what LLMs have done, if I can think of an analogy to bring it all together, is they've turned the entire world of technology into Lego bricks. It's another example. So I built this power switching system, and rather than having to design the electronics to control it and having a switch and a dial and a screen and all this sort of things, I literally had an Arduino with a Bluetooth on it, connected it, and I just made a phone app. And I say I made a phone app. I didn't make a phone app. I told Codex, I said, this is the app I need to make it for me. Just put it onto an Android phone and it just works. So the power that inventors are getting now, if you have the imagination to decide on what you want to do, the power that AI is giving you is obscene. It's absolutely absurd. Certainly, if you look at in the economic output, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's literally stopped me from having to work with, say, 3 or 4 external consultants on this project because I can just do it myself. It's faster. That iterative process has become faster. Now, of course, what I've produced probably is nowhere near ready for any sort of real-time launch. I'm sure if you look at the code of the app that's here, it's going to be horrific with horrors inside the code of somebody who knows what they're talking about. But a year ago, you couldn't even have done this. What's going to happen in a year, 2 years? So, sorry, I was going off on a slight tangent there because to say to people listening, the environment that you find yourself in now for innovation has never been seen before in terms of your ability to be productive. So look around you, question everything, never accept the status quo. And if you come up with something to say, actually, I don't like this particular process. Why does this process even need to exist? Can we do it another way? You've got this backup that can sit behind you and help you do things that you would never even have dreamed of doing a year, 2 or 3 years ago. And the final point to say is that if you look at a lot of the innovation programs around doctors in the UK, I would say I don't see 5 to 98% of innovation work among UK healthcare workers is almost certainly in the digital space. And a lot of it probably falls into the optimization category. So they take an existing process and they're trying to somehow optimize the category. Now, that is vitally important. Look at what Patchwork did, for example, to locum application. But just thinking out loud here, you've got to be relatively lucky and in the right time, right place to find a particular optimization pathway to do really well out of it. Now, you guys did, and you're a relatively rare, real success story out of that. But you hear too often, you hear these medics going, "Oh, I'm making a new app tracker for this particular condition," and you sort of go, "Oh, well done, good. That's good to work on it." But is it really worth your time? So clinicians need to take that little step further back and say, okay, rather than making an app tracker, I'm actually going to make the platform to allow anyone to track the symptoms of any condition, rather than making the particular app to track those conditions. It's all about taking a slightly higher step and saying, rather than just optimizing something, I'm going to create something from nothing where something didn't exist. And that's how you get the real step changes in healthcare innovation, I think. That's what fascinates me. When
Mm.
after you have spent time thinking about a problem, something that didn't exist in the world before now exists. That's a new piece of IP. And that could be a patent, it could be a piece of software that, you might not necessarily be able to get a patent on something, but if something's sufficiently difficult and you've solved that problem, it's fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's super inspiring to hear what you've described, because I think, to some extent, what you're describing here is that the barriers to entry have reduced so much, even in something as opaque and as difficult as hardware. And to your point about, you know, innovators focusing on digital optimizations, I completely agree. I see this all the time. There's certainly an emphasis on digital because it feels easier
Mm.
to enter that space compared to what you're doing. But I hope that the audience listening can take away from all this that actually, it is very achievable, and there is a playbook and a pattern to actually developing hardware. And I think to your point about that optimization piece, instead of solving the whole problem, I see that risk constantly. And I give similar advice that if you're a point solution in an ecosystem, you may be consumed by that ecosystem. If you need to connect in as, a pathway improvement for, that needs to connect into an EPR, well, there's always the risk that it's not a big enough problem for it to stand on its own legs, or it gets consumed by the upstream player. So I think that point also as well is think bigger, think, yeah, I think just think broader as to what you can achieve beyond that optimization. I think is just a great lesson to end this episode with, and it's a point of reflection for all the clinicians listening.
Just one other point, Jane. You're mentioning hardware a lot. I actually don't necessarily see it as just hardware. I see it as complex software as well. Because
Mm.
I'll come back to the example. Take the example of an LLM. LLMs aren't hardware, but they are ridiculously complicated. I mean, I can't only pretend to understand exactly how they're working. Um, but as a thing to solve problems, as a venture to create something new, my goodness, what an amazing example. So it's not necessarily saying to people focus on creating hardware because the hardware is particularly unique. It's not. You just focus on solving a really, really difficult problem. And actually, I would even put it like this: focus on solving a problem that you don't know if it actually has an answer. Because I give you, coming back to the example of a basic app that tracks symptoms. Before you even set out to do this venture, there's a solution. You just pick a few bits, put them all together, and you create some sort of solution to this thing. Focus on a problem that you don't know if you can even solve it, because those are the really exciting problems. Because if you solve those problems, you've genuinely created something new. And to echo your point, we have torpedoed the barriers to entry for any of these sorts of things, because that's one of the ways. I'm very, very difficult to impress when someone shows me a new technology, and I've used LLMs and the advent of AI probably since 2022, but it's only really been in the last year, maybe 8 months, that I've started to become really impressed, because it's drastically changed how I develop hardware and complex problem solving.
You're absolutely right. And you're right as well that, it's not just, we shouldn't just view things binary as software and hardware. There's all the complexity in the middle. But I guess the take home here is you can go after the hard things. And I think
Mm,
that's just a great lesson
mm.
for everyone to take home. So fantastic. So that's all the time we have for today. And for those listening, if you like what you hear and want to support the show, please do like and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever podcast platform you're currently listening to us on. It would mean a lot to me, and it would help spread the message to others exploring alternative paths. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time. Bye bye.